Over the last couple weeks in this series on mission, the second part of our identity statement is that we are a church without walls. We're a church about Jesus. That's what we're about. If we had to explain it in the most basic terms to anybody, we are a church about Jesus, and we're a church without walls. Of course, we have walls. What are we really talking about? We want to make Jesus known. We want to make Jesus known. We want to be a witness. Chaplain Schaefer shared last week and challenged us to be a witness. This morning, we have a guest as well, Pastor Conrad Smith. No relation. I know Smith, a very uncommon name. No relation, other than friends. We're friends. And I've had a joy over the last couple months. Me and Conrad had got to know each other. He's the pastor at Grace Bible Church, which is 5 minutes away. And so I've had a joy of meeting him on Tuesdays for coffee and for breakfast and getting to know him and to pray with him and to talk with him. And he's an incredibly humble man. He's an incredibly smart man. He's a gifted teacher. For those of you who were with us during Christmas Eve, you probably heard him speak as well. And we're excited, the opportunity that we have to partner with Grace Bible in the future. We're planning right now in the summer to do an outreach event. And so it's just in the works. We don't have it. It's very much in the works. We don't know everything about it yet. But we're looking forward to that. You might be thinking, maybe, we've been doing this series on mission, right? Why would we invite another local pastor to come on a series on mission, right? Aren't they the competition? Isn't Grace Bible, aren't they the competition? No, yes, that is the correct answer. You only think that if you totally misunderstand what the mission of God is about. What is it about? Is it about Grace Church in Lanham? Or is it about the kingdom of God? Yeah. Yes. I don't have candy to give out for the right answers. That's the correct answer. You get free coffee in the back for answering correctly. The enemy, I'm talking about Satan. We were just talking in Genesis and introduced him. He wants us to view our brothers and sisters across the street and in the community as competitors instead of partners. Who's Jesus speaking to? I mean, we can go over and over again. One of Jesus' final prayer, praying for unity. Believe it or not, it's not just unity in Grace Church in Lanham, unity in the church. You talk about the mission, the Great Commission. Who's he speaking to? I mean, yes, he's speaking to the disciples there, but who is it written to? It's the church's mission. And so I'm glad that we could end here and just have Conrad share with us. I wanted him to come and speak. It worked out that we were away, and he's been graciously willing to share with us. And we'll just welcome him on stage, and glad to hear from you, friend.
Hello. We live in the empire. The people who wrote our scriptures lived in the occupied country. Makes it very hard for us to really identify. I hate to say it, but in some ways, we live in what might have been more like Russia, and they live in what might have been more like Ukraine. Rome was very prosperous and wealthy, and the people who wrote our New Testament were an occupied nation. Keep that in mind as you think about this passage that we're talking about today, that I have called Mindset and Mission. So you have that up on the screen there. Eric said, a church without walls. He shared some with me as I was preparing about kind of the theme you're on. I think you've heard messages from Acts 1:8, from John 4, Jesus and Samaritan woman. So I want to talk about mindset and mission, and the mindset being you, me, us, the church, letting go of you. You let go of you. So the scripture was just read. I'm not going to reread it. But in the context, this is 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 through 27, just to kind of make sure we're grounding this in what Paul was actually writing about. Paul has just coached the Corinthians about how to handle questions of conscience. That's chapter 8. We, living in a free area, living in the empire, we tend to focus on our freedom and our rights. But Paul rejects that primary focus on personal rights, not because they're bad, but he rejects that primary focus on personal rights and preferences to emphasize making yourself a slave. We dumb it down a little bit, serve. But he's really saying, I make myself a slave. Imagine that being your life ambition. I'm going to make myself a slave. He emphasizes that, giving himself and Barnabas as examples of freely giving up rights for the sake of this thing we call church. That's in the early part of chapter 9, verses 1 through 18. So then we get to this passage starting in verse 19. And just to kind of quickly walk through it before I elaborate some and try to ask us some questions and make some points for today. In verses 19 through 23, Paul says true freedom is self-mastery, self-awareness, inner strength. That's what he's aiming for. The athlete is temperate in all things, that idea. So true freedom comes from that ability to have that internally. Really, you can almost call it an internal strength. It's not dependent on your ego wall or your degrees or people noticing you or image. So that you then, not being hung up in all that, can meet people where they are. The most radical statement in these verses 19 through 23 of chapter 9, is in verse 21, where Paul says, to those outside the law or without the law, I become as someone without the law. Now that takes, this is a saved Pharisee who uses a word that in other contexts could be translated lawless. The Antichrist is even called a man of lawlessness. So Paul is saying, to the lawless, I become as lawless. Imagine a Pharisee saying that. It's such a radical statement about meeting people where they are that this is the one he qualifies a little bit. He says, not that I'm a lawless person. I'm not going to do anything. I do have a boundary. I will not do anything that actually is against Jesus. But short of that, I will meet people where they are. I just find that such a radical statement coming from a guy who killed people who didn't toe the party line before. And how much he's changed. That leads us to verses 24 through 27, and I'll be coming back through these as I talk, but he says, do you not know in a race only one person wins? Well, that statement from Paul, that actually troubled early Christians. I'm not going to take a lot of time with it right now, but they didn't like it because they're like, no, the Christian life is not about one person winning. It's not a competition. Okay. Even like church followers like Origen really struggled with that. They didn't like that statement. Wait, one person wins? I mean, if that's really what Paul means, the winner's already run the race. That's Jesus. So, but I don't think that's really what he's saying. I think he's saying there's only one mentality. Anybody can have it. But there's only one mentality that is sufficient to honor the gospel that we have been entrusted with, to be on mission. That mentality is, to use the fancy word, incarnational. It takes on a body, it shows up in space and time, and it serves on their terms as much as possible without dishonoring Christ. This is why you need to be a church without walls. You go into the world. Jesus said it. He prayed it. Eric referred to the prayer. I want them in the world, but not of the world. It takes on the culture and the forms of the people it's trying to show Christ to. Not come meet me in my culture and what I'm comfortable with. So that mentality, to really live that out day in and day out, requires tremendous self-awareness, tremendous discipline. Like, we have to be on mission, or we just sink into what's comfortable for us, especially when you live in the empire. It's such tremendous awareness and discipline that he compares it to two things, really. Most of the comparison is to the Olympic track star, but the other one is to what you can call like a pancration fighter, what we might call a boxer. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because this is not boxing like we think of boxing. This doesn't really have many rules, and it's pretty brutal. So the level of discipline. This is not MMA cage fighting. This is much worse. That's what he compares it to, that you need to have this kind of mentality. Think about everything that those people give up. And we'll think especially about the fighter, because he knows he's going to be stepping into that arena. Now, he's not a gladiator. I'll tone it down a little bit. They didn't usually end in death when he talks about a fighter here. But there's this radical statement in verse 27 where Paul says, I discipline my body. I'll come back to that. Because we, living in the comfortable empire, and even in this Western world in general, for centuries, have done a really good job of separating spirit from body. And they are separate. Your body goes back to dust, and your soul goes on to be with God. But for as long as they're in the body, they're not really separate. And spiritual, emotional, soul discipline is harder than physical discipline. But it includes it. It includes and transcends. We live in a body. So the kind of spiritual and emotional and just like flexible discipline that we need to cultivate doesn't work too well when our body is just super comfortable in our easy chair all the time. It just kind of doesn't flow very well together. Nothing, but hey, I love my easy chair. God gave us virtually all things to enjoy. You know, he loves for us to enjoy these things. So he's not a killjoy. But in all the we just read, and prayed about, pray that we might live peaceable lives. God doesn't want us in this harsh, brutal, war-torn world. But he wants us to have a mentality that could thrive even in that situation. Paul is not saying he abused his body like what we call ascetics, who thought by abusing their body that automatically made them spiritual. He rejects that in Colossians 2 if you took time to read it. So no, that's a lie. That appears wise, but that's not true. However, as I just said, he's emphasizing that emotional and spiritual discipline, though by itself it has some profit, spiritual discipline profits for eternity. That's from 1 Timothy 4:8. It's also from 1 Corinthians 9:25, discipline, the passage we just read. So just if I could just get this phrase to sink into your head, include and transcend. Include and transcend. So spiritual awareness, spiritual discipline, being on mission includes but transcends physical discipline. If we're coddling ourselves physically all the time, it's very hard to be spiritually disciplined. So physical discipline can happen without spiritual enlightenment. That happened with these fighters and these runners all the time. But spiritual enlightenment includes physical discipline. Not that Paul trained like an Olympic track star, though technically right around Corinth it wasn't called the Olympics. They were the Isthmus Games. Corinth was on an isthmus. And they were held every 2 years. And they were just below the Olympics. And people from all over the Greek world came to compete in them. It was serious stuff. And Corinth had hosted it, stopped hosting it, and then by the time we get to this passage, they're getting ready to host them again. So, again, Paul is speaking the language of the culture. These people in 1 Corinthians 9 would have been very familiar with the athletic track stars, the fighters, the people that competed in these games. Corinth hosted them. that region hosted them. Not that Paul himself trained like those guys did. Remember, Paul is probably in his 50s at this point. I'm in my 50s. I can't train like I used to train. I mean, I can for one day. Then I'm... he didn't train. I'm not saying he trained like that. That would have left no time for his calling as an apostle. But, and we also know he probably had significant health issues. 2 Corinthians, he mentions his thorn in the flesh, whatever that is. So here's a guy in his 50s with some compromised health. But remember, what he's really talking about here is mentality. It's not about performance. He can't perform at a level you could perform when you were younger. But there's a mentality you cultivate. Life is training. Learn to listen to the trainer's voice. It's always training. You're always training. It's just whether you're training well or poorly. So in his 50s, Paul's mentality is more focused than it's ever been. So he definitely did train his body. The language in verse 27 is clear. He beat his body and continuously kept it under control. He led it where he wanted it to go, not vice versa. Francis of Assisi called his body, because he called everything, brother, sun, sister, moon, brother, sister, bird, all these things. He called his body brother ass, brother donkey. Pretty good beast of burden, really had to stay on top of it because it was quite stubborn. And if it didn't want to move, it didn't want to move. So that's what Francis called his own body. And while the comparison to fighting should not be overplayed, his focus on discipline, even fighting, is clear. There's some contemporary language, Testament of Solomon, where a demon says, I am thwarted by this archangel. The archangel beat the demon down. Spiritual discipline is embodied. This shouldn't shock us. It's incarnational. The Word became flesh. Remember, the point is discipline, focus, mindset, mission, church without walls, not performance. As you age, you can't perform at that level physically, but you can still cultivate the mentality. So now imagine all of this, and there's context and there's some of the technical parts, so we can kind of get to kind of our big questions in a moment. But just imagine Paul the Pharisee, Acts 17, he's in Athens. He is angry at all the idolatry he sees. Hey, that's not surprising. I mean, on one level, God's angry about it. But he bites his tongue, mentality, I'm on mission here. I'm supposed to reach these people. I'm supposed to show that I'm for them. He bites his tongue. He walks through the city. He finds an idol, uses an idol. A Pharisee uses an idol to reach the people. He doesn't quote from the Old Testament. They don't know it. He uses an idol. He doesn't just use an idol. As he shares about the idol, he quotes from a hymn to Zeus. And it is a hymn to Zeus. We just sang some hymns. Okay, hymn is a spiritual song to Zeus. He took it out of the hymnal from a temple of Zeus. That is religious. Now, you're going to go to a mosque later. And we want to make sure you don't say anything, supports that religion per se, but he quotes from a hymn to Zeus. So you're never actually getting anywhere before God got there because he's everywhere. It takes a lot of mentality to say, how do I see God in this? How do I represent him? How can I build on what he's already doing? That's Acts 17. What's Acts 18? Corinth. He goes from Athens to Corinth, and then this letter is him writing back to them after he spent 18 months in Corinth. And we see how idolatrous and immoral and messed up the Corinthians are. They needed discipline. They needed a change in mentality. Now, we're at a season of the year where this Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. In historical Christendom, that's a time for discipline. Christianity Today had an article that they put out. It's a guy named Paul Kalanithi, if I pronounced it correctly. In 2013, very sharp guy. He was completing his medical residency and was on his way to becoming a neurosurgeon at Stanford University. This is not rocket science. It's harder than rocket science. This guy's on his way to becoming a neurosurgeon when he was diagnosed at age 36 with stage 4 lung cancer. Wow. His oncologist shared this with him. His oncologist, this is a God thing. As an oncologist said, it's terminal. You don't have long. The oncologist said to him, this is not the end, or even the beginning of the end. This is just the end of the beginning. He died 2 years later. For followers of Jesus, this life is never the end. If Russia launches a nuke, this is not the end. It's only the beginning of the end. It's just the end of the beginning. The beginning of an eternity. We say we believe this. And I think we do. I mean, this is a sister church. I look out on this room. I think we believe it, but we live in the empire. We're comfortable. We're anesthetized to the presence of death. That wasn't Paul. This was a world for the vast majority of people without private bathrooms. We have an avoidance of death and even the talk of death because we can. We can get away with it. We've been conditioned. We live in a prosperous place. We have a fixation on pleasure. Pleasure's good. God gives us richly all things to enjoy. But we have a level of prosperity that allows us to hide death from our daily view until Ukraine. Now it's bombarding us in our living rooms. We can ignore it, we can deny it, we can subvert it. So we don't ponder deeply. We don't consider. We don't number our days, like Psalm 90 tells us to do. We don't reckon with our own limitations and the limits of this life. But Ash Wednesday can be a little reminder. It's this week. Ash Wednesday looks to the cross. And the cross is before the resurrection. So what did Paul let go of? What was Paul falsely identifying with? That he had to be removed from him. We know he went through a lot of loss. What had to be stripped away from him so that the real Paul, the Paul that God had created to be, the Paul that God had redeemed to be, the Paul that God had made provision to be through this indwelling Spirit. What had to be stripped away from him? Well, we know the answer really is everything for him, even his health. In a moment of great humility, Paul says, well, if I had been healthy, I'd be a conceited jerk. And I know my preference. Door number 1, conceited jerk. Don't want that. Door number 2, unhealthy. Door number 3, healthy, humble. And Paul's like, I want that door. There is no door number 3. Not for you, Paul. Now, I want door number 3. There's no door number 3. So really, the real life choice is pain and humility or health and arrogance. And he wrestled with it and said, well, I'll choose pain and humility. That was Paul. That doesn't mean it's all of us. We know he had some reasons to be conceited. He'd gotten a lot of revelations. But what did he have to let go of? What was the sacrifice? But then you realize, well, we're sacrificing stuff that's all related to the end of the beginning. How much can we really sacrifice? Your life, I have a news for us. I think we know you're losing it anyway. were no less terminal than Paul Kalanithi when he got that diagnosis. We don't feel that way. So we have questions to ask ourselves. Our first question, and you see it in this text, verse 19, when Paul says he makes himself a slave, are we free enough to be slaves? Just ask yourself that one throughout the week coming up. Am I free enough? Because all this stuff that I think I have, if I can't let it go, I don't have it. It has me. Am I free enough to be a slave? Paul's not ultimately the example of this. Jesus is, who had all the glory of God, but emptied himself of it and made himself a slave. So are you free enough to be a slave? To take on the forms of the culture you're trying to reach? Question number 2. Can we become the culture we are called to reach? What do we need to change to reach Lanham? And it is we, not Grace Bible and Lanham Grace. Eric's right. Hate to admit it, but he is right, because I'm really competitive. No, that's a joke, I hope. Might be a little truth in it. But, no, he's right. In the end, Grace Bible and Lanham Grace and every other Bible-believing church is one church. We just don't act like it or even like we know it. Can we become the culture we're called to reach? Who is my neighbor? Whoever you see. Remember that verse 21 from a Pharisee. To the lawless, I become the lawless. Third question, do we understand the 2 illustrations? The racing one, I think we get. But I talked about it earlier. Can only one person win? No, that's not what Paul's talking about. The early church got too hung up on that. And if we make it that wooden and literal, well, Jesus is the winner. Do we have the mentality? Do you bring the kind of focus to identifying with other people and connecting with them that an Olympic track star brings to his training? That a fighter, a pancration fighter, pancration, all war. That's what it literally means. All out fight. And that's the one I want to land on. For your fourth question, do we want to be the real deal? Do we want to be authentic? Because he says in verse 27, I discipline my body. But that's too soft a term here. One language expert says it's a feeble translation, the word discipline. It's weak. It's not wrong. It's just weak because it doesn't really capture what these Corinthians would have thought of when Paul talks about this term. Remember, they hosted these games. While it literally means to strike under the eye, that could sound like false asceticism. It was really a boxer, yes, but these were boxers who, they weren't allowed to gouge eyes. They weren't allowed to groin strike. That was about it. And when they stepped into the arena to fight, they took oxhide bands that they wrapped their hands in. These oxhide bands were covered with knots and nails, and they were wrapped with lead and iron. They were sometimes literally called limb breakers. And Corinth hosted these games. So do you think they're not getting that metaphor? And Paul says, I bring that kind of discipline to my mission. Lest, having preached to others, I would be found disqualified, inauthentic, not the real deal. Out of all the people that Paul served with and ministered with, do you know which guy he called the most real deal? Didn't give it a name. There is actually only one right answer here. Timothy. Timothy. Paul says, when he says, I don't want to be disqualified, I don't want to be found not to be genuine. In Philippians 2, Paul says, I'm sending Timothy to you because I can't come because I'm under arrest. I have no one like him who's so genuine. Timothy was authentic. He had some fear issues, apparently. See, Paul, we're not talking about being flawless. We're talking about, am I in? Is this something I'm going to for comfort for me? Because it does that. We need it. We're lost souls. We need comfort. We need to be saved. But am I embracing the mission? So it's no longer about my comfort. I'll make myself a slave. And remember, limb breakers. Some of the descriptions of these guys who were fighters and what their bodies were like because of the beatings they would take. Spiritual discipline is embodied. Every thought and feeling we have is also a bodily event for as long as we're in this body. So I want to close with a story. Okay. So what is that? Can you tell what that is? Can you see that well enough? Any guesses? A restroom. Well, you're on the right track. What's that? It's a sewage backup in a basement. Sewage backup. So I guess it's kind of a restroom. So, I got saved right before my senior year in high school. I wasn't raised in the Christian faith at all. I don't have time to really go into that testimony. I've shared it with Eric. But I wandered around quite a bit, eventually ended at Washington Bible College. Graduated from Washington Bible College. I was broke, had to make money. Got a job in the business world. That would have been when I met Nathan. He's a little kid, because his aunt is my wife. And I was working that business job. And I told my wife, Dottie, that at some point I'd probably go to seminary, that I really felt like pursuing vocational ministry was probably in my future. And I did. And I couldn't work that business job and go to seminary and survive and be it all there for my family. So I left the job and got a job at the apartment complex where we lived, on the maintenance crew. So the sewer backup's starting to come into focus maybe a little bit. All right, so working maintenance, and when you worked maintenance, it was at Forest Lake Apartments. They're still here, just right down the road. When you worked maintenance, you had to take call, your turn of holidays and 1 weekend a month. It's 1992, maybe 1993. I think it was 1992. So I was like 27. And I was on call for Christmas. Now, there's no smartphones or anything back then, right? You carry a beeper. And you can't go more than like 2 miles from the campus. Like you can go to the grocery store or whatever, but you got to be nearby because you got to be able to get to a phone and call if your beeper goes off. That's the technology at that time. Well, there was a death in the Long family. And my wife, she was pregnant with our second child. We had a little baby at that point, toddler. And so she went down to Georgia for this family funeral, but it was Christmas. I couldn't go. I was on call. Couldn't get anybody to take call, late notice. So I was alone on Christmas morning. About 5 a.m., the beeper goes off. Beep, 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 beep. Like fumbling around, pick it up, call the phone number. Christmas morning, person says, hey, I just went in the laundry room. There's some water coming up the pipe. I'm like, oh no. We'd already been told. If there's a backup, all hands on deck. You call everybody. The whole maintenance crew is supposed to show up. This is Christmas morning. And you have to just grind on this thing and get it taken care of because it's going to start flooding apartments. This is going to start flooding apartments in the basement. Well, I'm trying to call people. Remember, I don't have a smartphone with me. So I'm picking up my phone right away and calling. Well, that's not true. I ran out, checked it out. I'm like, oh no, it is a sewer backup. Ran back to my apartment. I'm literally running because it's getting worse. So I start calling everybody. It's 5 o'clock on Christmas morning. Nobody answered their phones. If they were around, they're like, I didn't hear that. No. So I run down to the maintenance shop to start. It's Christmas morning, December 25th. It's cold. To start up our little tractor, which has a cart that it can tow that has all of our plumbing supplies. The cart's about this size. Don't want to exaggerate it. And it's full of all this heavy-duty commercial snakes and things like that. But they're heavy. So I go in there to back the tractor up, to hook up the cart, to drive it to the place where I have to get into the basement access room to snake the pipes. Start the tractor. Christmas morning. 6 o'clock by now. You can't be like, oh, well, I tried. So I unhook the trailer, and I start pulling it by hand across the development to the basement. I'm like dying by the time I get there, and the work's just beginning. The water is not just in the laundry room anymore, it's out in the hallway. And water. So you start snaking this thing. There's access pipes on the wall. You get a plumber's wrench to take them off. If you're familiar with that, they just have a square on them. They're heavy duty. This is an industrial snake, so you ram the first one in, you're running it through this thing, and if it buckles and catches, you don't hang on to it, you let go, because it'll break your hand, break your wrist. It's that strong. Meanwhile, the pipe is now open. We're in the basement. Anybody flushes the toilet? Anybody does anything? It's splattering out the hole. You can hear it coming. So it's like, incoming. I'm in boots. By the way, remember, I'm by myself. And you can't stop. Totally true story. And I'm splattered. I'm standing in it. I'm ramming this thing down. It's somewhere pretty deep down the pipe. I'm starting to run out of stuff. I'm like, oh my gosh, what if I run out of snake? And you're racing against time. I'm sore. I'm alone. It's Christmas morning. I don't think my mentality was quite where Paul was asking us to be in 1 Corinthians 9. I was starting to get maybe a little bit frustrated, especially since no one else showed up. But you can't stop. Here's the beauty of the story. I'm grinding away at this. I'm starting to think maybe a little bit of profane thoughts, maybe just a little. I'm sore. You can't stop. I'm splattered in sewage, standing in sewage. And this thought hit my brain, not audible voice, but just clear as a bell. Why are you upset? Isn't Christmas morning when I stepped into the world to clean up its sewage? And nothing changed, and everything changed in a moment of time, no longer than that I just shared with you. And I kept working. And I got the backup. And the water went down. Now, there's still a lot of cleanup to do. I've got to pull that snake out, wrap it up, load it back on the trailer, squeegee everything down the laundry room drain, disinfect the whole apartment, mop the whole downstairs of the basement because it was getting very close to people's doors on their Christmas morning. So I do all that. I'm hauling this stuff back to the trailer, throwing it up there, as I start to throw the last bits of snake on, one guy shows up from the crew and helped me drag the trailer back and put it away. And that guy was an illegal immigrant who woke up and saw that his phone had rang and checked it out and came and helped me. So, if we can go back to our last question. Sewer backup. Do I even want to be the real deal? Now that Christmas story might make me look like a pretty positive light. Trust me, my attitude wasn't good. I will say one thing. I didn't quit. And sometimes that's the bottom line. Job got a bad attitude throughout the book, but he didn't quit. And then he received the blessing. So don't quit. Guess what? A slave never has the option to quit. We'll walk off a job. Slave doesn't have that option. I make myself a slave. We do have the option. We can quit. We could be disqualified. We can lose the reward. That doesn't mean lose your soul. You can lose the reward. But don't quit. And by the way, you'll feel it in your body, just like that Christmas morning. But Christmas morning is the perfect time to clean up the sewage. I've never forgotten that lesson. It is probably the single most imprinted Christmas memory in my whole life. I'll never forget that story. And it was the worst Christmas ever. It was the best Christmas ever in the long run. Mindset and mission. Thank you for your time. Can I pray? Father, I thank you for this opportunity. I thank you for Lanham Grace. I thank you for the relationship our churches have had for all these years, and that we are, in the end, part of one beautiful body of Christ. Help us to really embrace the mission. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.